You're listening to the Plastic Shift Podcast. Welcome to the Plastic Shift Podcast. I'm Madhav Malhotra, one of the students at the Plastic Shift, and I'm reaching out to several experts working to solve issues with plastic pollution. This podcast showcases unique perspectives on this massive problem to identify what its most important aspects are.
Today, I'm joined by Dr. Eleni Iacovidou, a lecturer in environmental management at the Brunel University London. Her work focuses on resource and waste management systems in industries like plastics, food, and construction, and especially how they can be used to bring about the circular economy. I'm very excited to learn more about how plastics play a role in the different aspects of this very, very important problem. So thank you for joining me today. I'm very excited to have you join us and learn a little bit more about your work. And I think it's very interesting, all of the different areas that you've been looking at this problem and the problem of the circular economy in general through. But first of all, I'd love to just ask you a little bit about your background and some of your research interests.
Thank you, Madhav. I'm really pleased to be joining you today, and I'm grateful for giving me the opportunity to join you in these podcasts. So I'm a lecturer in environmental management at Brunel University London, and I do research on environmental management, specifically focusing on resources and waste management systems. So I try to develop methods for performing holistic and integrated analysis of environmental, economic, social, and technical aspects that compose the sustainability, if you like, of our systems. So in my teaching, I focus on environmental management, environmental governance, and sustainable development aspects.
And I think it's really interesting to hear about some of the overview details there. And I know when it comes to the specific research papers that I was looking through that you published, someone would find it very interesting, I think, to look at all of the different industries that it encompasses while still looking at the general topic of waste management and environmental management. Could you give us an introduction of the different industries that are involved with the circular economy and the role that plastic industries play in that in particular?
In the circular economy, I think everyone has a role to play. Why? Because we are all involved in some ways or in the process of utilizing resources as well as disposing these resources as wastes. So if we really want to achieve the circular economy, we really need to think holistically and include everyone who is involved, all the business stakeholders, the policymakers, and even the public, the consumers themselves, who are purchasing the products and components that are flowing in our system and are also responsible for their proper disposal so that these wasted resources can be properly managed so that they can return back into the system either as biological or technical nutrients. And this encompasses the main idea around circular economy.
And when thinking about these different industries, I wanted to ask you about, I know you've been looking into ones like the construction industry and food waste and even e-waste and plastics. Across all of these different areas, I wanted to ask you about some of the progress that we've been making in the past few decades. And based on that, where do you think are the areas that need the most attention when trying to transition from a linear economy to a circular economy? And how do we evaluate that specifically based on how much progress we've made in these industries versus how much potential there's still left that's untapped?
You know, the different areas that you've described at the beginning are very different. I mean, if you take food waste, you need to understand how the food is produced, how it's flowing in the system, and how it's being disposed in order to come up with a strategy, a system-wide strategy that enables its recovery. The same goes for construction materials, e-waste, and plastic packaging specifically, which is an area that I've been focusing quite a lot. So you've asked about how we measure progress. We measure progress by looking at how much of these resources, how much of these waste resources have been recovered in our system or have been utilized effectively. And that's a key word. Effectively doesn't always necessarily mean recycling. It can mean anything that can help us to recover maximum value from these different types of waste. And I'll give you an example. For example, in the construction sector, we have construction components such as columns, beams. These are structural components that are used in buildings, which can last from 20 to 50 years or even longer. So when you try to demolish a building because it's no longer needed, if you recover these components and they're still functional, then you can return them back into the economy as reusable components. In the food waste system, you cannot do that. Food waste is perishable, it's biodegradable, and hasn't got a long lifetime, which means that once you consume a specific food item, and some of it you don't want and you're disposing it as waste, it's a matter of a couple of days for it to start rotting. So you need to have in place another way of utilizing this resource and extracting some value out of it. The plastic is a different case. We can recycle plastics in order to get back the polymer and make new components and materials out of it. So there are different approaches to different sectors that can help us to achieve the circular economy. And in order to be able to measure progress and assess which are the key processes that can enable us to achieve maximum value, to recover maximum value from our resources, is a system-wide approach where you look at how the resources are extracted, how they are processed in order to produce different components and products that are flowing in our economy, how are these used in our system, and how are they then being disposed, collected, and managed. So it's a number of different steps that we have to take into account. And on top of that, in order to be able to assess the sustainability of the entire system, at each step, we need to be able to measure the environmental, the economic, the social, the technical values that we gain or we lose in the system, in each process of the system and in the system as a whole. And then we also need to take into account the geographical area, the context, and the political aspects that govern that particular system.
Mm-hmm. And even from just that, we can see how complicated this already gets.
Exactly.
But I think a really interesting aspect that you mentioned was how you analyze this issue in terms of the key steps that the life cycle of a material involves, from the resource extraction to the end of life management. When it comes to
Exactly.
this kind of life cycle, where do you think are some of the best areas for intervention? Because oftentimes, especially when it comes to plastics, in this industry, we often see a lot of attention with managing the end of life, say, disposal of plastics, whether that be when they're improperly disposed and they end up in the oceans, or whether that be at the actual recycling center. But as you mentioned, like there's so many other parts of the picture. Could you talk about some of the challenges there with each of the different steps and some of the biggest areas for intervention?
I think that in order to identify the best areas for intervention, you need to first understand the system as a whole. So you need to look at what drivers and barriers exist at the design, at the production, the use, the disposal, and management processes within the same system, and try to see which of these steps really hinder the extraction of value from our ways. In the case of plastic, because you particularly place some focus on that, we can have interventions at every and each of the stages involving the life cycle of these materials. For example, the design is really important because designing plastics in a way that make them more recyclable or with clear labeling that helps the consumers make decisions at the disposal stage, it's really important in recovering the value from that particular material. And the same goes to the production. If you add some additives on the plastic to give it some specific properties, you may as well disrupt its recyclability potential. And that is the case with the biodegradable plastics. Some additives do not allow these biodegradable plastics to be broken down into smaller segments, and as a result, they cannot be properly degraded in the natural environment. And specific conditions are needed for their management, but not many people know that. The consumers think that whatever is biodegradable should be fine in the composting, home composting bins or in composting facilities that their local council provides, but this is not the case. And that's where we go back to the design and we try to add labels on the products we produce, whether it's bio-based and biodegradable plastic or it's petrochemical-based conventional plastic, in order to help the consumers take the right decision when they are purchasing that particular product or even disposing it into their household and on the go. And then it's the management aspects, and that's where a lot of challenges we face at the moment hinder quite a lot the amount of plastics that we recycle, because we have contamination to deal with, we have technological barriers because we need advanced near-infrared technologies to sort specific types of plastics from others in order to ensure that we have a good purity. And then we have the remaining contaminants on the polymers because of the glue that is used on different packaging materials, for example, or the additives we have on the e-waste plastic materials that give them some useful properties. So it's very complex, and we need to look at the system holistically, and it's not always easy. It's very complicated, but it's needed because it's the only way to identify the right interventions. And sometimes identifying the right interventions is not just about understanding what is the need for the specific material itself and how we can recover maximum value from it. It also has to do with how much that particular intervention meets the needs of the stakeholders involved in the system.
Mm-hmm. And I know you were talking earlier about the other types of impacts that the life cycle of plastic can bring when it comes to, say, the social impact or the political impact. And especially when you're talking about how with, say, different geographies or different countries or even just municipalities, there can be different stakeholders with different needs.
Exactly.
Oftentimes in, say, reports, we would see that people are measuring the economic impact of the issue primarily. So this is the amount of resource, the material value, or this is the amount of costs that come to the recycling. When it comes to the other aspects though, what are some of the considerations that you use, some of the things that you observe and measure when it comes to making these decisions on a political or social level?
It's a structured process that we usually follow. And because my research has led me to develop a specific approach that helps us to think in a more structured way, I usually try to follow that approach because it helps us to look at the system more holistically and try to see where the opportunities are and where the barriers are as well. So this approach is called complex value optimization for resource recovery from waste, and it's abbreviated as CVOR, CVORR. So in this approach, our first step when we're looking at a specific system is to set up the boundaries. For example, our latest report in where we use this approach, the boundaries were in England, and we were trying to look at the plastic packaging system in England and trying to see how we can improve the recycling rates of the plastic packaging that is flowing in that system. So that's step number one, setting the boundaries and understanding your system. And then it's about understanding the processes involved in the system. And that's where we follow and we use the material flow analysis, which is a tool where we can track the flows of the plastic packaging within a system from the input into the market, which can be production within England, for example, or it can be imports within that specific region. And then you track it down, and that gives you an indication of the processes involved in a system. And it also gives you an indication of the amount and the volume of plastic packaging that you have from the one process to the other. And that kind of material flow analysis can give us an insight as to how much litter you have in the environment, how much plastic packaging is littered, how much is disposed in the households, how much is disposed on the go, and how much of this is collected by local authorities, and how much is going to energy from waste facilities, for example, landfill or recycling facilities. So that's the second step. And then you have the monetary flow analysis. Why do we have this monetary flow analysis? It's an analysis where you actually see the exchanges of money between the different stakeholders involved in the processes you identified in the material flow analysis. And the reason why you have that step is because these monetary exchanges can tell you who are the business stakeholders involved in the system, and as well as other stakeholders such as political stakeholders and social stakeholders involved in the system. So you can have an insight into the dynamics between the stakeholders and get a little bit of insight into who has the power to influence the particular processes involved in the system. And after you identify your stakeholders and the power dynamics between them, you have another step where you look at how that flow of plastic packaging in your system and the stakeholders that control it impact on the natural environment and provisioning services. What kind of technologies, infrastructure we have in place in order to support the recovery of value from the plastic packaging waste, or how these technologies support changes on the design of the plastic packaging that is flowing in the system in order to eventually support the proper management of this resource. You then look at the governance and the regulatory instruments, such as, for example, the extended producer responsibility and how it's been implemented in that specific region, and whether it's monitored properly and we can get a good insight into what's happening to the plastic packaging waste. Is it being recycled? Is it being exported? Do the producers do their part in promoting the recycling of the plastic packaging they place on the system? And that's just an example. And then we also look at the activities performed by the businesses and how the market supports these activities. For example, when we recycle the plastic packaging waste, let's say PET and HDPE, which are commonly known as the high value plastic waste streams, how much of these can be absorbed by the secondary materials market? This is an important prerequisite that you need to take into account when you're promoting the recycling of plastic packaging waste. And then you also need to look at how people behave. How do they dispose their plastic packaging? Do they actually segregate their recyclables in the household, or do they just chuck it into the residual waste bin, and eventually that plastic packaging is not being recycled but is being combusted or is being disposed of to landfill? And that gives you an indication as to how much changes you can inflict on that system and where the values lie based on stakeholders' perspective, as well as their dynamics and their preferences for changing the system. And that is important because the transition and interventions are not easy to be implemented businesses will only engage if there's something in it for them. So if we want to bring changes in our systems, we need to generate the evidence that the businesses and the policymakers need in order to make decisions. And this doesn't come easy. It's after you generate the evidence and you engage in discussions with them, and you try to see which changes they are willing to make and how far they are willing to go, so that it doesn't impact their operations and profitability.
Mm-hmm. And it really goes to reinforce the idea you've been bringing up the entire time, which is the need for looking at the system holistically. And
Exactly.
especially like with the complexity of your research and finding this evidence to allow different stakeholders to take action on it. I think it's really amazing to see how the academic community can start the process of gathering this kind of data to allow others to make decisions that are actionable and that actually can lead to a change, which doesn't come easily, as you mentioned. They need some kind of evidence and proof to be able to found these decisions on. And I think that's where I wanted to ask you my last question, which was about the solutions that can come about from this kind of research. So based on all of these different steps of the life cycle of plastics, and also all of the different elements that you've considered with the material flows, with the monetary flows, with the different stakeholders and how they interact with it. What do you think
Mm-hmm.
are some of the most promising solutions that can be implemented in this problem in the next 5 years? And then just personally, what are you most excited to see more research on or do more research on in the next 5 years?
Okay, thank you for your question. I think that when it comes to solutions, there is not an easy answer, because there are a lot of things that you can recommend, especially when you're looking at the entire system. You can see things that have to change in different parts of that particular system. For example, in the design, in the way us consumers handle our products and how we dispose our waste. So I think making some small changes can go a long way into achieving bigger change in a more structure, if you like, or methodical, I think it's the right word, way. And it would be wrong of me to make a recommendation for a specific change, because there are so many things that I have identified through my research that we really need to look into. And I think that's where my efforts will be placed over the next 5 years. So to answer the second part of your question, there's still a lot of things we don't know about the plastic system. We've been focusing too much on plastic packaging waste, but there's also plastics in the building and construction sector, in the agriculture sector, in the automotive sector, and in electronic sector, which needs to be taken into account and see how much value we can recover from that waste, because I think that it has, in some of these areas, there are a lot of things we have neglected. And then it's also about the issue of exporting our plastic waste to developing countries, where we know that these countries do not have the infrastructure for recycling huge amounts of such waste. So we really need to become a bit more mindful about our actions and try to orchestrate the changes that are definitely needed in order to help us promote sustainability in the long term and maximize the recovery of value from our resources.
Mm-hmm. And it's really interesting to hear about these areas of future work for yourself, but also the nuanced and humble look at the different solutions there and identifying that, there are so many that all need a lot of attention. So I wanted to thank you for all of the specific insights on this problem and talking about how it fits into the transition to a circular economy as a whole. It was really interesting to hear about the work you do and dive into some of the specifics of it and think more about what is coming in the near future.
Thank you so much for your time as well.